So welcome back to the Floriani Software Fundamentals video series on FTCU. My name is Mark Garetz and I'm a National Floriani educator. And in this section we're going to be discussing how you create lines and shapes using the various tools in the software. So if you'll remember, in one of our very early lessons we talked about the various image types, and in that we discussed vector images, and we talked about the fact that vectors are lines that make up shapes, and then we use those shapes to fill with stitches in the software. So what we're going to be talking about in this section is how we create lines and shapes using vectors. Now the most commonly used tool to do that in the software is right here. It's your line input tool, and it has three different modes. It has your normal mode, and then if I click the little drop down by it, it also has a pen mode, and it also has a Bezier mode, and we'll come back to that in a little bit, but let's just focus on line mode to begin with. When I'm in line mode, you'll see that this is lit up and my normal select mode is not, and my cursor is a little crosshair. Now I can start putting in a line simply by clicking and putting in the points of that line. Now the most simple line consists of 2 points, a beginning and an ending point. So let's go ahead and enter one of those lines. So I'm going to click, and I'm not dragging, I'm just left clicking, and if I come over to where I want the other end of my line to be, I would simply click again, and that would put in the first segment of that line. And it didn't make it exactly straight, but that's okay. If I want to continue adding segments, I could continue clicking, but what I'm going to do now is just end this, and the way I end my input is with a right click. So I've right clicked and I've put in that line, and I'm going to click off it so you can see the line again. And then if I reselect it, you'll see all my controls. So if I wanted to resize this line, I want to make a copy of it, lock it, rotate it, I can do that with these controls. Now they're kind of close together because I only have one line here, but if I had a bigger object or my line went off in a different direction, I'd have a bigger bounding box. But I'm going to click off it again because I want to show you how we would then, once we've created this line, we would manipulate it. So the way I would do that is I would select it, and then I would come over here to this tool, which we haven't really talked about, and it is the shape tool. And this shape tool is the key to manipulating lines and objects. So I'm going to go ahead and click it, and when I do that, you can now see I've got my blue square nodes on each end that define the ends of this line. And if I had more than one node in here, or anchor or point, you would see it along here. Now as I get close to one of these, you'll see that I get a little blue dot by my cursor, and I can do that over here as well. I get a little blue dot by it. That tells me that I'm close enough to that end or that node that I could click now and select it. So let me just go over the top of it, click and select it, and once I've got it selected, I can actually move it around. So if I want to change where this is, I can move it around. All right, so if I didn't draw it in the right place and I just need to extend it a little bit or make it a little bit shorter or change the way it goes, I can do that. So there's my new line. Now the other thing I can do in shape mode is with a line like this, if I get somewhere in the middle of it and not close to an end, you'll see that my cursor changes to that little bent line with 2 dots on the end, and this is a mode we call rubber band mode. So if I click now and drag my mouse, I can actually put a bend in that line. Okay, so I can bend that line around, and wherever I clicked, that would do it. Now if I don't like what that was, I could undo it. So if I wanted to put the bend over here, I could click and drag and I would bend it from there. So this is a new feature we just added actually, and this is kind of a quick and easy way to take and make a curved line out of a straight line. Now I'm going to undo all of that so I have a straight line. And I'm going to show you one other thing here, and that is that if I right click on one of these points, I have a bunch of options. The one I want to talk about right now are these 4 modes right here of the way this point is. So the default when I put in a simple click is that it's going to be a line point, and that is a straight line point. So let me explain what that is by showing you. Okay, I'm going to click off of it, and I am going to actually delete this line. So I'm going to select it, and I'm going to use the new shortcut here to delete it. And I'm going to put in another line, but this time what I'm going to do is put in 3 points. So I'm going to put in a point here, a point up here, and a point down here. And then I'm going to right click to end it. And I'm going to go back to shape mode, and you can see these are my 3 nodes that make up this line. Now this point right here, in fact all these points right now are what we call straight line points, and if I right click again, it's this one right here. A straight line point does exactly what it sounds like. What that means technically is that the entry and exit to all of the points, or at least the line points, is a straight line. So it goes in straight and it comes out straight. If I want to change it to a different style of point, I have these 3 other choices. I have cusp, smooth, and symmetrical. And we're going to go to smooth first. So I'm going to click smooth, and this is what we call a curved point as opposed to a straight line point. So when I do that, you see I have a curve in here instead of a line point. If I wanted to go back to a line point, I could right click on it and I could click line and it would straighten it out. So let me go back to that smooth point, click it, and when I now click on this point, I get these right here, which are what we call handles, right? So I can now click and drag these handles around to adjust how the curve goes in and out of that point. So if I drag this one out, I get a different angle going in, and I can also rotate it. So if I move it, you'll see that I change what happens with that line, and I can do all kinds of things, including even make loops out of it. And you might think that doing something complicated like this would take a lot of points, but in fact I still only have 3 points there. Now the curves that we're talking about here, those are called Bezier curves, and they were named after a French mathematician named Bezier, who came up with this concept of using simple points to define complex lines and shapes. And that's what vectors are all about. Now, what happens here when I move, I'm on the right point, right handle. If I move the right handle down, you'll see that the left handle moves up. And if I move this one up, you'll see it goes down. So it's kind of like a seesaw. So these 2 handles are in sync. They kind of go in opposite directions of each other, but whatever I do to one in terms of up and down or rotating happens in the other. But you'll notice the length of it is independent. All right, so I can make that length independent of the one on the left. And if I want to change the one on the left, I can click it and I can drag it to do something different. But as I rotate it, you'll see that no matter what I do, they stay in step. Now, if I don't want that to happen, if I want them to always do exactly the same thing, well then that's what a symmetrical curved point does. A symmetrical curved point, whatever I do to the one on the left or right, mirrors itself on the other side. So watch when I drag, you see that they extend the same. If I move them, they still do the seesaw thing. But the main thing is the angle of that curve going in is going to be the same on both sides, as opposed to having them independently adjustable when I'm on the smooth point. Now the last point I want to show you, that's called a cusp point, and that's this one right here. And this is what we use when we want to have complete independent control over both sides of our point. So watch what happens with this. I can move this in and out independently, but if I rotate it, notice that my other one doesn't do anything. It just stays there. So this allows me to create shapes that look like this with oblique angles like this, or sharp points. That's called a cusp point. And so to review one more time, I've got, let me just right click on this to change it. I've got a line point, which is going to have no curves at all, straight line point. I've got my smooth point, which allows me to adjust the angles in and out independently, but my handle orientation stays in lockstep. My symmetrical point allows both angles to be adjusted exactly the same, and also my up and down rotation stays in lockstep. And then lastly, I've got my cusp point, which lets me move anything I want independently to get any complex curve shape I want. So I could come back and click this one and move this out like this. So I can create any shape I want to, even something complicated like that, with just 3 points. So that is your basic input of line points, and I used straight line points to input this, and then I changed those points, at least this middle one here, to curves, and these points out here, they're still line points. Okay, so they are not curve points at all. I could change them into curve points if I want to, but usually at the beginning and the end, I like to leave those as line points. Now I'm going to actually select this line and I'm going to delete it because I'm going to show you another way to input curved points. And that is if I select my line input tool and I do a left click. If I were to simply do another left click over here, I'd be putting in a straight line point. But if I would like to put in a curved point here, I can hold down my control key, and I apologize that you can't see me doing this, but I'm holding down the control key on my keyboard, and now when I click, I am going to start putting in curved points. Now there's no curve there yet because I've only got the 2 points, but if I put in another point here, you'll see how it starts to curve. Okay, so I can draw any shape I want to using control, and then if I want to start putting in straight line points from here, I can let off control and I can start putting in straight lines, and then I can put in curved lines again by holding down control. So this is how we draw lines in our normal line input mode. Now I'm going to right click to lock that line into place. Remember, when you're done drawing, you want to right click. Now I'm going to show you why this line input mode is so powerful and how we would use it in the real world. So I'm going to go ahead and delete the shape that I drew, and I'm going to bring in a backdrop. And you remember how we did that by clicking our backdrop tool. Remember when we talked about backdrops, we talked about the fact that when we digitize, we trace over the top of these images. So let's bring in this balloon, and I'm going to click open, and let's make, well, we don't really need to make this any bigger. We'll just zoom into it here. So we'll grab our magnifying glass and we're going to trace around the top of this balloon shape here. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go and get my line tool, and now I'm going to start tracing over this line. So I'm going to start right here, and I'm going to do a regular left click. And now I know I want these lines to be curved, so I'm going to hold down my control key and I am going to click around. Now there's no need to click, 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 click to try and get the shape to follow. You'll see because of the line mode with the curved lines that it's automatically going to follow this shape. Now this first one looks wrong, but don't forget, when I click my next point, that one's going to curve again. So it is going to curve around, and it didn't do such a great job down there on the bottom. We'll come back and we'll show you how to fix that. So I probably went just a little bit too far, but you'll notice that as I click around, that line is hugging the edge of that balloon pretty good. Now I'm not being super accurate here, and I'm just going to end right here. I'm not going to try and go around that corner, and I'm going to right click to end it. Now I've got a line here. Now this line didn't match perfectly, so if I want to fix it, I would go in here to my shape mode, and I could, for example, move this point down a little bit, and you can see that as I move it, I can see where that line is coming in, because remember I said I probably clicked out too far. So if I come down a little bit, that brings it into line. If I undo that, the other way I could do it is I could actually use the handles to correct that line, but you see how it affected the one on the other side there, and I don't necessarily want to do that. So then I would come in here and I would change this to a cusp point so that I can have control over this side independent and not affect what happened over there. So I would just kind of move that out a little bit, and that's another way to do it. Now the reality is that in the real world, no one would ever see this picture of the balloon, so that little bit of drawing inconsistency, not following the exact shape, the real world, probably no one would ever notice that because no one's ever going to see this balloon. But that's a little bit of a digitizing trick. So one thing I could do is if I wanted to now close up this shape, and I'm going to ignore this little part down here. If I wanted to close it across here so I could then fill it in, I can do that by coming over here to this icon right here, which is Close Shape. So I could click that and it would close the shape, but I'm going to show you another way to do it. When I have selected this normally, that icon is also right here. So if I click this now and I click off it, you'll see that that shape is now closed up around that balloon. So that is a quick overview of how we would use this line input tool in normal line input mode. So now let's go over the other two line input modes we have, and that is pen mode and Bezier mode. To do that, I'm going to turn off my backdrop temporarily so we're not distracted by that. And I'm going to select the line that we drew and I'm going to delete it. And we're going to switch our input modes. And pen mode is the middle one here. If I select it, my cursor now looks like a little pen or pencil. And if I click and drag now, I can freehand draw. So I'm just going to make some squiggles here. And when I make those squiggles and I let off, it's going to put in the points. Now you'll notice that it didn't put in 1,000 points. It tried to put in as few points as possible to create that complicated line. And I can use my shape tool to manipulate it if I need to. Now this mode works best if you have a pen tablet, and works even better if you have one of the tablets that has a display on it, or one of the new computers like, for example, a Microsoft Surface that allows you to use a pen and draw directly on the screen. Drawing with your mouse is pretty difficult. I don't tend to do it. And most people I know don't do it. So if you have a pen monitor or a pen tablet, then pen mode is a pretty cool way to do your input. Now the last input mode I want to talk to you about is something we call Bezier mode. And if I click the drop down, that is the last icon here, Bezier. And you'll notice that my cursor has a little curved point by it, so that reminds us that we're in Bezier mode. The way this works is if I simply click, I will get straight line points just like I did in regular line input mode. But if I click and drag, I will start to get curves. All right, so I'm clicking and dragging, and then if I click and drag here, and click and drag here, and click and drag here, let me just change the way I did that, okay, I will get my curves. All right, so if I click and drag, I will get those curves as I put them in. Now, following a shape with this mode is a little bit tricky, and you've got to practice with it. And this is really an advanced digitizer's mode because it's very, very fast to input, because you're not having to worry about control clicking and all those other things. So that's the three basic ways that we draw lines in the software. We use normal line input mode, pen mode, or Bezier mode. Now I have turned my grid back on and I've got a new screen up here because I want to show you now a really useful input mode, and that is something that we touched on called Snap to Grid. So if I right click on my ruler and I turn on Snap to Grid, what that means now is if I want to input line points, so let me just use my normal line point mode, when I click, that point is going to snap to an intersection of my grid lines. So if I wanted to draw a square in here, I could say count over 3 grid lines and click. I could come over 3 more, and then I could come down 6. Let me see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And I could come over here and back up here, and then when I right clicked on it, I would have a square. Now, one thing to keep in mind is that I've got something that looks like a square, but this is in fact not actually a closed up shape. This is actually a line that just runs around the edge, and there's an open end right here. If I want to close it up, I would click this icon right here, which is my close icon, or I would click this one right here, which is the same icon. So if I do that, you're not going to see that it looks much different, but it does create a closed shape. So snapping to the grid is a real useful tool if we want to make sure that when we input something that it ends up in exactly the spots that we want. And this is not the only way we can make a square, because a better way sometimes to make a square or a rectangle is to use the built-in drawing tools. So I am going to turn off this, or actually delete it by deleting it. I'm going to come up and turn off snap to grid, and my built-in shape tools are right here. So if I click this icon, again I've got a drop down which has rectangles, ellipses or circles, triangles, pentagons, and hexagons. So these are built-in shapes that I can draw with. So I can, for example, click rectangle, and I can start to click and drag and make an arbitrary sized rectangle. If I want to make this a perfect square, if I hold down the Control key, you will notice that it snapped to a perfect square. So no matter what I do, this is now going to be a perfect square. Now it's real important if I'm using this mode that I keep holding down Control and let off the mouse in order to get that perfect square in. So let me actually delete that. We'll do it one more time. Come back and select my rectangle tool. And if I hold down Control, I'll be drawing a perfect square. But if I accidentally let off Control first, and then I were to let off the mouse, you'll notice that it's no longer a perfect square. So the sequence of letting off that Control key is important, wants to be the very last thing that you do. So that's how you would create one of the predefined shapes. So that was a square. Let me delete that. I'll just show you a couple more. I'll show you the ellipse function here, which if you simply click and drag, you can make any type of ellipse you want to. Or if I hold down Control, it'll make perfect circles. All right. So that's a real quick and easy way to draw a shape using the built-in shapes. And one last item that's here in this drop-down is something called custom shapes. And we're going to come back to this later, and we're not going to talk about that now. But those are predefined shapes in the shape of various things like bears and things like that that you can select from. Now, I want to talk about how we would further edit this shape. So one thing we could do is we could use our controls here to resize it. We could transform it over here in our transform box. We can rotate it, and this doesn't make any sense because it's a perfect circle, but we could rotate it around. We could close it up. Now this one's already closed, and this one appeared because it knows we have an artwork shape here, and this is actually a shortcut to get to my shape tool. So if I click it, I will get right into my shape tool. I don't have to come over here and do that. When I do that, you'll notice that this circle is made up of 4 points. And like I said, this is already a closed shape. But what if I wanted a nice semicircle? What could I do? Well, there's a real nice function in our shape tool. When you right click on a point, you can select something called split line. And this would split this shape right at that point. You can also, I'm going to click off it for a second. You can also right click anywhere on it. Wait, I have to select it first. Hold on. Okay, I can get my select tool or my shape tool. And if I right click here, I can say split line there. So I don't have to split it at a point. I can split this line anywhere I like. But let's come up here and right click, and we'll split the line right here. Now, what that made was still a circle, but instead of being a closed shape, it's open right here. So it's not real useful. So if I come over here, however, and repeat that process and look at my sequence view before I do anything, there's a perfect circle in there right now. If I split this line, now I have split this into 2 independent objects. So this is a semicircle line, and this is a semicircle line. So I can select one or the other and delete or move the part that I don't want. So if I just wanted the semicircle on the top, I could select that bottom one, and I could either delete it over here, or I could click this icon right here to delete it. Now, if I want to modify what this is like, I can go to my shape tool, and I can move this point around if I want to. I can change the type of point. So if I change this to a line point, it wouldn't be a circle anymore, but these were still curve points. So this gives us a different effect than it did when I showed you the same thing, and these were line points out here. If I wanted to change these into line points, I could. I'm going to just undo a couple times here to get back to our real semicircle. And let me just show you a few other things that you can do here. We can also add a point. We can also delete a point. So if I delete this point, what do you think it's going to look like? Let's try it. I'm going to delete that point. And what I've got now is just a 2-point line, but since these are curves, I've got a curve going all the way in here and out there, and I'm going to undo that to put that point back. Now, when we are working with complicated shapes, and especially stitch shapes, and we'll get to that in a bit, we have an edit menu here which lets you choose what you're going to edit. Now all we have here right now is outlines, so that's my only selection, and it would be the same as all. But when I had stitches, I'd have other things in here, and we will see that when we get into working with modifying stitches. I can also close a line here, so if I click close line, it's going to make a closed shape across. Now you'd think it might make a straight line, but remember these are curve points, so it didn't. I'm going to undo that because clicking close over here would do the same thing when I have it selected. I have to have it selected, then if I do close shape, it's going to close that shape. But you notice it did it differently because it kind of closed it symmetrically as opposed to just closing that line. So these are some of the things that you can do with the shape tool and in creating shapes. Now while we're on the subject of artwork and working with shapes, I want to talk to you about how we would combine shapes to make more complex shapes. So to do that, I'm actually going to select my shape here that I've been left with, and I'm going to actually delete it. And I'm going to create 2 circles. So I'm going to come here and I'm going to create a circle, and I'm going to hold down Control to make it a perfect circle. Then I'm going to make a duplicate of it using this cool copy and paste new function that we have, and I'm going to move this one over here just a little bit. All right, so now I've got 2 intersecting circles on my screen. Now before we go any further, I'm going to make this a little bit easier to see by increasing the width of these lines. So to do that, I'm going to select them all by dragging a box around. I'm going to go over here to my artwork properties box, and right here I've got something called pen width. All right, and I can change the width of this line. Now what it defaults to is 0.0, which is what we call a hairline. So it actually has no width. And if I make this bigger, like let's say I make it 0.5 millimeter, and I click apply, you're going to have a fatter line in there. And I could keep making it fatter. I could go say even up to something like 2 millimeters, and it would be a really big fat line. Now one thing to understand about this is that no matter how fat I make the line, it's only a visual reference. The actual line that would be used to create objects, etc., is actually just that thin hairline in the center of this thick line. So I'm going to go back to a 0.5 and click apply. And the last thing is we have this fill here, which if I click it, would fill that shape in, and click apply, and you'll notice that now those shapes are filled in. Again, this is just for our visual reference. The fill really doesn't matter to anything. So later on we'll see how we could fill this with stitches, for example. I can fill one of these circles with stitches regardless of whether it's filled in here or not. And again, if I wanted to see these in a different color, I would just use my color palette down here to change the color that these are in. So we're going to leave this line here. What I want to show you now is some of the artwork manipulation tools that we have built in. And the most common 3 are right up here, and this one is called trim, this one is called weld, and this one is called intersect. There's a couple more. I'll show you how to get to those in a second. But if I were to click weld, watch what happens. What I end up now with is a shape that is just the outline of both of those shapes. So whatever was going on in here, that's gone now. So I've welded this into a more complex shape. So sometimes making complex shapes is easier using functions like this rather than trying to draw this kind of a shape. So I'm going to undo that to show you what the other 2 do, and I'm going to select both of them, and you'll notice that they're grayed out until I select 2 things. let's just take a look at this one. This is called trim. What this is going to do is it's going to take the shape that's on the top and it's going to trim out the bottom shape so that there's no overlap there. So if I were to just click this shape right now and move it out of the way, you would see that that trimmed out a piece of that in the shape of this that was overlapping. So that is one way to do that. There's another more advanced way to do that. I'll show you that in a second. But just to review what this does, it takes whatever's on the top and cuts it out on the bottom like it was using this like a cookie cutter. All right, so that is trim. And again, I want to point out that these are all grayed out now because I've only got one object selected. And I'm going to undo the trim so that they are back to the original. And the last one is intersect, which is going to kind of cut both of them. So it's just going to give me this football shape here in the middle because that was the intersection of those two. So it eliminated everything else. I'm going to undo that because there's a couple of more modes that are hiding when you right click. Now we didn't see them earlier when we right clicked because I only had one thing selected. Now that I have two, if I right click, I've got something called transform artwork. And I could do remove overlapped artwork, which in this case would do the same thing as that trim did. Here's my weld and my intersect and my trim, but I also have exclude. And if I click that, it is going to give me, watch what happens when I move this off, it is going to make a shape that is kind of the opposite of an intersect. So it excluded what was overlapped and just left me these two sides, all right? So when they were together, if I undo that move, it looked the same, but it's not really because if I were to fill these shapes, watch what they look like, you would see that I really had nothing here in the center. So that's another one of these options called exclude, and you get to it when you right click. And again, I'm going to undo that so that they're not excluded. And I want to right click one more time because I want to talk to you about this one here, transform artwork, remove overlapped artwork. So like we said before, that was the same as a trim, but that only works on the items that you have selected. When you bring in vector art from the real world, vector art typically is made up of shapes or vectors, but when most people use vector art, they get printed. And in the printing process, the printer and its driver in the software actually takes out the overlapping pieces so it doesn't print them over and over again. But in the embroidery world, that creates a problem. So let's do this. Let me just change the color of this circle here, and actually I need to undo some more because I'm still trimmed, okay? So, or excluded. So let me grab this one and I'm going to make it a light blue and I'm going to fill it in and I'm going to click apply and then I'm going to just fill this one in, apply. Now if I were to convert these into stitches, I would convert this whole circle into stitches. So what's underneath here would stitch and what's on top would stitch. But if I were to print this, it would automatically eliminate the blue underneath here. But in the embroidery, I would create a lot of excess stitches under here if I did that. So there's lots of different ways to remove those excess stitches. I could do that trim that we talked about, and that would do it. I could, when I'm in stitch mode, you'll see we have something called remove overlapping stitches, which is very similar to remove overlapping artwork. But remove overlapping artwork takes a look at a vector shape that has a whole bunch of overlaps in it and just takes them all out automatically so that we don't have an overlapping stitch problem. So just be aware that when you bring in a piece of vector art, it might consist of a whole bunch of overlapping pieces. So that's what that does. So what I want to cover now are some of the other modes we have in the shape tool. So to do that, I'm going to select the single circle that I have here on my screen. And I'm going to come up to my shape tool, and you'll notice that below the shape tool there's that little fly out arrow that we've talked about a couple times. If I click it, I have two other options. I have my normal shape tool, I have something called the slice tool, and I have something called Add Outline. Now I'm going to click the Slice tool, and what this does is it gives me this knife. This allows me to slice a shape into two pieces by making a line across it. So if I click outside, and you have to start outside. So if I start outside over here, if I want to make a line going across this way, I would click, and then I would come down to the other side, and I would click, and I would have a straight line. To tell it that I'm done slicing, I would right click, and what I have now is I have two objects. Now, what's different about this is that both of these objects are sliced, and I've created a straight line segment going between them. So you can see that I didn't have to close up these two shapes because I have a straight line. I didn't have to close up these shapes because that's what the slice tool does. It made this nice slice across them and split them nicely into two different objects. So I'm going to undo the fact that I moved it apart, and I'm actually going to undo the fact that I sliced it, because remember that the other way to do it was with your shape tool, and you could have come here and said split the line, and you could have come down here and said split the line. But when I do that, what I've got is two semicircles. I don't have two closed shapes. And look what happened up here. Because this was a curved shape, it kind of gave me a weird curve in here. Now I could go in and try to fix that, but sometimes using that slice tool is a much easier way to do it. So I'm going to undo all of those changes that I did and go back to a nice piece of artwork. One more thing about the slice tool is that I'm not limited to just those 2 points. So if I wanted to make a kind of irregular slice in here, I could start here, for example, come here, and I can click inside to get a very weird looking slice. Like say I was carving a pumpkin or making the top of an egg or something. Now if I move this piece off, it has that shape through there. So I'm going to undo that one more time. And of course you can't do that with split line. Now the last thing I want to talk to you about is how we would create a hole in a shape. So I've got this blue circle on here, and what if I want to create a hole in it? Well, I also do that with my shape tool, but it's the last fly out here, and when we're in artwork mode, it's called Add Outline. When it's in a fill, it's actually called Add Hole, but they both do exactly the same thing. So we're going to add another outline to this, which is going to create a hole. So you got to be completely within the shape for this to work. And what you're going to do is you're going to start to click, and you're just going to draw the shape that you want a hole in. So I'm just drawing this kind of weird random shape here. When you get it in the shape that you want, and you're going to also remember that it's going to want to close this up, because we're going to come over here and click close. So if I wanted to, make sure this closed in a certain way, I'd want to get as close over here with a point as I can. But if I don't mind that there's a straight line between here and here, I come over here and click close shape. When I do that, it's going to close up the shape. I have one more thing I need to do to create that hole, and that is to somewhere outside of the shape right click on it, and you'll see that that creates a hole in it. Now once I have the hole here, these are just regular old points, so I can bend these lines, I can change the type, so I could make this a cusp, and I could click on it, and I could bend what this does, etc. So I can make any kind of complex shape in here. When I want to get rid of this hole, the way I do it is I right click anywhere on it, and I'll have an item here now called delete hole. So if I click that, it'll make the hole go away. So again, if I come back up here to add outline, same as create hole, if I hold down control, I'll get curved lines just like I do when I'm drawing points. So I'm going to finish that up, and I'm going to close the line, right click out here, and now I've got my hole in there. So once again, I'm going to actually delete this hole, because what if I want to make a hole in the shape of another shape? Like I don't want to draw that shape, I just want to use another vector outline to create that hole. Well, I certainly can do that. So let me just get another shape, and let me show you another shape tool here. Here's the triangle tool. So what if I want to make a triangle shape hole inside this circle, just like that? Okay, now I apologize, it's the wrong color. You can't see it. Let me change the color so you can see it. There we go. All right, so if I want to cut out this hole, the way I do it is with a tool up here called Combine. Now the Combine tool does lots of different things, but when we're working with closed shapes of artwork like this, the Combine tool is sort of like versions of these, but it just does various things, and I'll show you how they kind of interact and work. So if I want to create a hole in this shape, I want to make sure that this is all the way inside the shape. And in order to combine two objects, first of all, they have to be the same type of object. So I have to combine artwork and artwork, or a run stitch and a run stitch, or a fill and a fill, or something like that. So I couldn't combine a fill and a run, for example, but I can combine two pieces of artwork, so that's what we're going to do. And I can combine more than two if I select them. But notice that right now my combine tool is grayed out because I only have one thing selected, but if I select everything, now my combine tool is lit up. So when I click that, what's going to happen is, first of all, it takes the fill away because I had one object with the fill and one without, and it didn't know what to do. So if I put the fill back and click apply, you'll see that I have cut out a hole in the shape of that triangle. And that artwork triangle, it's no longer there because I've created a combined shape out of those two. Now, if I want to undo that, that's what break apart does. So if I click break apart, I will have my triangle back. So you can see I've got an artwork triangle here, and I've got an artwork circle. And that triangle, again, is back to the blue color. So if I make it a different color and I put it on top by dragging it in my sequence view, you can see that that's there. Now what happens if these two shapes are not within one another? In other words, what if this triangle is not completely within the circle? If it's out here like this, for example, what happens? Well, it kind of works like an exclude at that point. So let me just select everything, and then I'll do my combine again, and you'll see that what happened is that it worked like an exclude in terms of this middle part here went away and it left these two parts. The difference is that when I did that exclusion, I ended up with two separate shapes. When I use it to do with combine, I now have a single shape that's in this complex shape. All right, so that is one use of the combine tool, is to knock a hole out of something in the shape of something else. I don't want to draw it and use the create outline or create hole tools. So that is your basic shape manipulation and creation.